In the heart of Paris in 1800, where every corner smelled of cheap wine, aristocratic sweat, and moldy dreams, walking the streets in clothes that did not belong to your assigned gender was far more than an act of rebellion. It was a social sentence written in invisible ink. The entire city seemed built to judge. It didn't matter whether someone sought freedom, expression, or just a breath of dignity. Paris always charged a price, and a very high one. To dress as the other sex meant becoming a living scandal, a walking reminder that society despised anything that made it think. And even more, anything that forced it to confront its own hypocrisy. While the nobility invented luxuries and debaucheries behind velvet doors, the poor soul who dared to wear a dress or a coat out of alignment became a public spectacle, the venomous laughter dripping like acid onto the damp stones of the city. But ironically, because Paris has always been an ironic lover, many of those pointing fingers were the same ones who, during lantern-soaked nights, sought exactly these deviations. The city lived on contradictions, and its judgments were as fragile as the promises of politicians. Guards pretended to defend moral order while accepting a handful of extra coins to forget what they saw. Moralistic ladies, trapped in corsets that barely allowed them to breathe, murmured indignation while watching with the curious sparkle what they secretly wished they could experience themselves. Every look thrown at a crossdresser was a mixture of public disgust and private fascination, as if the mere act of daring to be different revealed something no one had the courage to admit. Worse still was the political climate, heavy like a sky on the verge of collapse. After the revolution, the city liked to pretend it marched toward liberty, equality, and fraternity. But everyone knew that was nothing more than revolutionary advertising. Anyone who dressed differently was quickly labeled a symbol of chaos, a threat, a sign of moral decay. The person who dared to cross Rue Saint-Denis in a lace dress, or stroll across Pont-Neuf in men's boots and a daring hat, was marked as an enemy of public order. Not because they truly posed a threat, but because it was convenient to turn them into scapegoats. France had many problems, but blaming a man in a dress or a woman in a coat was far easier than admitting the real issue was the country itself, drowning in contradictions. To be a crossdresser in 1800 meant carrying a double burden, the weight of one's own body, and the weight of collective ignorance. As they walked through the alleys, trying simply to exist, each step echoed a silent sentence. It was a tragic dance between courage and humiliation. Many spent entire nights hiding among alleyways, waiting for a moment when they could return home unseen, as if their existence could only be tolerated in darkness. Others endured insults, shoves, and spit dripping from moralistic mouths. The world had found a cruel way to remind them that violence doesn't always require weapons. Sometimes, all it takes is a look, a whisper, a perfectly timed laugh to destroy what remains of someone's dignity. And yet, there was something almost poetic in this silent resistance. Even faced with ridicule, these individuals walked, insisted, existed, on the edges of the city, where artists, poets, and broken souls gathered. Some found refuge. There, among scribbled walls, cheap wine, and timid applause, they could breathe. In truth, many of these transgressors were freer than those who mocked them. Facing the world's laughter requires strength. Facing oneself requires even more. The newspapers of the time, full of moralism and cheap ink, took every small incident and turned it into national scandal. A delirious guard arresting someone in improper clothing would become the headline of the next day. The decadence of the streets of Paris. It was almost comical that a country willing to tolerate corruption, hunger, and inequality somehow found itself offended by the fabric worn by a passerby. But such was society, distracting itself with small outrages to avoid confronting its massive failures. There was also the legal aspect, because even oppression needs official paperwork to feel legitimate. In 1800, a law required a medical authorization for anyone to wear clothing of the opposite sex in public. It was an absurd document, issued with grotesque seriousness, as if a piece of paper had the power to regulate human identity. Getting such a document was nearly impossible, so most simply lived at the margins, hoping not to be caught. Those who were caught suffered punishments, some public, others exemplary, as if society needed to display its targets to keep fear alive. And the police. Oh, the police. Men in pristine uniforms, many with lives so miserable that their only joy was capturing someone more vulnerable. They walked with an air of authority but were driven by pettiness. For them, arresting a crossdresser wasn't just enforcing the law, it was a reminder that they still had some semblance of power. Paris gave them so little that any crumb of control over another soul felt like a feast. And so, night after night, they hunted those who simply existed outside the mold. Yet even in this suffocating atmosphere, there was a strange kind of grace. Not the graceful laughter of light moments, but the tragic grace that emerges when suffering becomes too absurd to take seriously. Many crossdressers developed a humor of their own, sharp, acidic, a weapon of survival. They laughed at insults, returned looks of disdain, walked with irony, because when the world tries to destroy you, sometimes the only way to stay alive is to laugh, laugh back, laugh louder, laugh until it hurts. Paris probably despised that laughter, because it came from a freedom no law could strip away. In the performance houses, where lights mingled with restless shadows, some crossed the line between gender and performance with such elegance that audiences were left breathless. Although clandestine, this underground world was the only space where expression wasn't a crime. There, behind heavy curtains and muffled applause, people could finally breathe. They could exist without masks, or, ironically, they could wear masks to reveal who they truly were. It was theater within theater, a parallel city built behind the curtains of society. Reputation, however, was an invisible prison no one could escape. A single rumor could destroy a life, and Paris devoured rumors like banquets. Anyone who dared cross gender boundaries had their name whispered for weeks. People delighted in scandal, even if they publicly denied it. Aristocratic salons, filled with nauseating perfumes and empty laughter, buzzed with gossip. It was strange how a society so obsessed with appearance lived in terror of someone wearing what they shouldn't be. The cruelest part was watching how many of these judges secretly hid their own desires, fantasies, and confusions. Paris was a city that dreamed in secret, moaned in secret, longed in secret, yet punished harshly anyone who dared live what everyone else repressed. Nothing was more dangerous than showing the world what it tried desperately to hide. Every crossdresser was a mirror, and no one likes the reflection that exposes what they deny. As the years passed, the city learned to coexist with everything it pretended to condemn. Hypocrisy became habit, and judgment became as routine as lighting a lantern. But the scars remained. The imposed shame was not merely social, it was deep, stitched into the soul. Many carried that mark for life, as if every insult thrown on the streets had turned into an invisible tattoo. The final tragedy was realizing society never wanted to protect anyone. It only wanted to maintain the illusion of control. And so, amidst the chaos and the city's decaying elegance, being a crossdresser in Paris in the year 1800 was less an act of style and more a silent war. A war against prejudice, against the law, against laughter, and against the city itself. A war lost on the outside, but not within. Because despite everything, every person who dared wear what reflected their truth left a small crack in the giant wall of Parisian hypocrisy. And that is precisely why the city considered them a disgrace, because they had the courage to do what Paris feared most, live without asking for permission. In the end, the real disgrace never belonged to those who wore forbidden fabrics. The real disgrace belonged to Paris itself, hiding its rot behind ridiculous laws, rushed judgments, and forced laughter. The city feared freedom, because too much freedom makes masks fall, and no one wants to see society's true face. The ultimate tragedy was that, while punishing others, Paris also exposed itself. It revealed its cowardice, its smallness, its visceral fear of anything it couldn't control. It showed, without realizing, that the true disgrace was never the crossdresser on the street. The true disgrace had always been Paris.